Recording in progress.
Our reading this morning is from musician and author Stephen McManavich from his book, The Art of Improvising as a Way of Life. This is what it means to be human, to learn and assimilate the patterns of culture, community, and environment, both conscious and unconscious, and alter them as needed. Make them ours, so that the voice spontaneously emerging is our voice, interdependent with the human world in which we live. Thus, we bring life into art and art into life. It means coming prepared, but not being attached to preparation. Everything flows as a creative act in process. Come prepared, but be willing to accept interruptions and invitations. Trust that the product of your preparation is not your plan, but yourself. Good morning. Oh, look at us approaching the spring equinox, the time when the sun crosses the celestial equator. I know we are not together in person yet, but we are together as we take in spring, each and every one of us taking it in our own way, still binds us in our whole, in our wholeness. Birds are returning to their summer playground, and daffodils are gracing us with their bright yellow blossoms. As COVID restrictions lessen and kids are back playing at the parks, we are turning toward that ardent sun of hope. What will come next for us as we unfold like the flower buds from this time of pandemic? Will there be vitality and balance in our lives as we emerge? To help us with that question, 2 Sundays ago, I spoke about spiritual maturity, what we need on the path for seeking life's deeper meanings. We talked about a commitment to self-awareness about our thoughts and actions. And today I want to continue along in that theme of deepening our spiritual and emotional resources and making our March theme of commitment. I'm going to take that right through as an introduction to our pledge drive. As most of you know, I spend a fair amount of time driving back and forth between Washington and Oregon. And I'll often fill at least part of that time by listening to podcasts or audiobooks. And every once in a while, one of them really grabs me. I mean, it's like, I want to live that way. I want to share this with the congregation. I see this as gripping and relevant for us. And on my commutes last month, I was listening to Stephen McManavich's book, and it's called The Art of Improvising as a Way of Life. And I read from it a few minutes ago. He is a professional musician and an improvisationalist within being a professional musician. He's done that for more than 40 years, playing the violin. He teaches around the world. And also very much a part of who he is his Zen Buddhism. And he talks about his life experiences that led him to insight. At its bedrock, the spiritual maturity and a well-lived life is based on a commitment of living into and playing with impermanence, imperfection, and improvising. So you can hear the Buddhism on the impermanence. He states that by living in the interdependent patterns of improvising music, he learned that play and playing is not only a way of connecting with others, just on a fun level, but also discovering what's already there on a deeper, more human level that is just waiting to be discovered. Everything he learned by playing music at home and around the world is now his recipe for how to live his life. And we can all do it, he says. So this morning, I want us to spend some time thinking and talking about improvising and impermanence, which I know we've talked about several times before, and especially the imperfection that all three of those things can deepen our spiritual maturity. They can also allow us to stop beating ourselves up for normal human mistakes. And as a result of all those things, we will live better lives for ourselves and for those around us and our community at large. So once Nachmanovich started having this new awareness about improvisation, that is when he began his lifelong exploration of the Buddhist idea of Dharma. Very insuccinctly stated, Dharma is what upholds the order in our universe. So he invited himself into this concept of impermanence and imperfection, and he came to see that making anything, including making our day-to-day lives, was not only a matter of displaying these skills, but it's this awakening of what is already within us and within others, but we haven't yet unveiled. And he calls that, part of that, the altruistic intentions that we hold within and others hold within, but we need to find and unveil them. For me, this was like having it all. This was an amazing discovery. So I can increase self-awareness. I can get in touch with those altruistic intentions. I can become more physically and emotionally available to others. And none of that comes with an expectation that I need to do it perfectly. I'm all in. So I had to bring this message to you. Bring your hopes, desires, and wounds and just show up and practice improvisation. Practicing in that liminal space within us, and between us. As Unitarians, that is our interconnected web. So this morning, especially during COVID, I want to talk about this imperfection piece in the message. This is our, should've, would've, could've, why didn't I do that? Why didn't I do that? And that really horrible self-talk about how stupid we are starts to show up. So instead of recognizing that those situations are just part of the normal human experience and finding our way to the goal, instead we chastise ourselves, we beat ourselves up, and because we beat ourselves up, we treat others the same way. So, is there anybody out there this morning that can say you are not your own worst critic? That we are not all our own worst critics? So, Nachmanovich's ideas can really help us here. He says that just like music, dance, meditation, medicine, teaching school, mistakes are part of a practice, not an arrival. They are part of our journey as we explore, as we move toward something that's important to us. So rather doing and being what you are, rather than chasing some elusive preparatory goal. This reminds me of the words of the poet and songwriter Leonard Cohen, who is inspired by the words of the Sufi mystic Rumi. And I'm sure you've heard these before, but let us bring these in like a daily mantra Cohen says, forget your perfect offering. Ring the bell that can still ring. There is a crack in everything, and that is how the light gets in. Ring the bell that still can ring. So what Rumi and Cohen and Nachmanovich are all saying is try to be comfortable with imperfection and with improvising. Put aside those grandiose ideas we always have about perfection and instead lean into trust and grace. The grace that we are enough as we are. Our gift is worthy. And hear our first Unitarian principle in that as well. We are inherently worthy. All we have to do is show up. Nachmanovich talks about this in his teaching of music. He talks about how brutal his music students could be with themselves. He said, he wanted to try to have them have freedom and to explore happiness and try to understand that when something went wrong in a performance, it wasn't a mistake. It was a learning opportunity and an opportunity to fine-tune and discover what they did want as well as what they didn't. He said sometimes they would play these beautiful, he calls them emotionally organized pieces. I'm not sure I totally understand what that means, but they were beautiful and they were organized and they touched the heart. And in other times, the students would be out of sync with each other, the piece was just a little off, and his students would say it was a mistake and it was an error. And they would say to him, why didn't you stop us? Because later, when they were talking about the piece or listening to a recording, they were like, why didn't you stop us? Because we were being so awful in that part. And he talked about that they thought they were bad and they were stupid and they were unworthy. So instead of just seeing this moment of being slightly off, these people are musicians. They're in college with a music major. They are so much better than our average musician. They would see this ineptitude and they believed they weren't good enough. And he tried to move them into focusing on what actually worked well in the piece. What did you enjoy about the piece? Always creating this atmosphere of affirming and trying to move away from self-punishment and guilt. And seeing it as a creative process. And that no self-punishment was needed or required. And all this time that we spend self-punishing actually takes away from our energy to create something beautiful. Beautiful for ourselves as well as beautiful for others. Another illustration from a less elevated place than playing music professionally and improvising professionally is in my little family of my mom and my two brothers and I, and how we came to this practice of imperfection, impermanence, and improvisation, although we didn't know we were doing it because I didn't have those words at the time. I know I've heard from several of you that, hey, Margot, we wish you would share a little more about your story in sermons because I realize we can't be together during COVID. So we don't have that nice coffee hour exchange and we don't have those nice impromptu moments. So I thought that I would use a little piece out of my own life, but it's not unique to my life. So many of us are having a similar experience. So I want to talk about my elderly mother and her three somewhat quasi-clueless kids. Not meaning that as not denigrating us there. I'm just saying we didn't have prior experience. We were in a very normal, everyday situation of the aging matriarch of the family. My mother was in her 80s, and she was living happily in her own home. She had dated a man for at least 10 years who was much younger than her, at least a decade. And they went on all these amazing adventures. They traveled together. They were very involved in their own community. They did volunteer work. But over time, he began to have health issues, and he also needed to stop driving, and he went to assisted living. And this happened pre-COVID, but not by too much. And for about 2 years before that, my brother and I were having concerns about my mom. They were mild, and as long as my mother and her date of that 10 years were spending time together, they were seeing each other 3 to 4 times a week, it was a mild concern and it was not a worry. And mostly we just celebrated their joy together. And after he went to assisted living, we tried to just support how they could still be together, how friends could create community for the two of them together, and how we could get her back and forth so they could have some time alone as well. So, but as the assisted living happened, we worried, we stewed, we grieved. It was a huge change to think of my mother living a more isolated life. We got angry, we got frustrated, and we didn't know at the time that that anger and frustration and worry was all related to our perfectionism. And it was the impermanence of the situation that was driving our grief. So then COVID came and things became more worrisome because my mother would put herself at physical risk, like she would get on a chair to get something out of the top shelf in her kitchen. And later she broke her arm because she was outside wrestling, pruning. She was pruning a large tree and part of the branch fell down. She was knocked over. Fortunately, some really lovely young people were crossing there and came over to help her. But can you hear the tension of what's going on there? My mother wants her independence. She wants to continue. She's a gardener. She wants to continue gardening and creating beauty in her space. And she doesn't want to wait till one of her kids comes over till she can get things out of the top shelf in her kitchen. So, but there needed to be a shift. There needed to be some improvisation in response to the impermanence. My mother's life had changed. She was no longer able to keep up, and so much of her volunteer work disappeared during COVID. So my brothers and I had some really unhelpful conversations with my mother over the years, asking her to stop doing these things. But she wanted her house just so. And she wanted her yard just so. And her life to be just so. And don't we all want that? We all want what we want when we want it. She's no different. My family is probably no different from yours in that regard. But that's not realistic to always have what you want when you want it, in the way that you want to receive it. So again, improvisation. What can we do? Well, she hired some yard help so she could stop pruning her trees. She also hired some low-income elderly house help that's provided at a very, very low cost. She agreed to wear a medical alert after she started having TIAs. But she made it very clear to us, I am not going to wear this all the time. We thought, well, okay, most of the time, and especially when you're out gardening, would be better than none of the time. So you would think after all of that, my brothers and I would just feel so much better. And we did for a time, but that was pretty superficial. Because our real issue was perfectionism. We didn't really know how to care for her, and we weren't really in a good partnership with decision making. So rather than dictating to her about what she should do, we maybe needed to listen more to what she wanted to do. The answer for us was finally to admit that we don't know what we're doing because this is our first time through this situation. And to also have some gratitude that my mother was still able to live in her own home, and able to still have some of her connections. So we had some ideas and we had some proposals. And when the four of us started talking together, and just talking rather than running to a solution to make us temporarily feel better, we started to divide up some tasks. My oldest brother took over keeping track of what needed to be done around the home. My other brother worked fairly close to where my mom lived, so he could take care of those little day-to-day things that would come up from time to time. And I helped my mom coordinate her banking, her medical appointments, get-togethers with friends, other services, and wow, I played a lot of Scrabble. I lost at Scrabble 90% of the time, celebrating that my mother was still so sharp with those words and those tiles. And as the months went on, we started to have some real, dough, to quote Homer Simpson, moments. By admitting, oh wow, I didn't think that through. Once we could normalize, yeah, we're going to do this imperfectly. That is going to be our day-to-day. And the only way we can make these little course corrections is by just having a non-defensive, non-critical conversation about that. So we tried to leave the shame and the blame at the door, and we just tried to tweak things when they didn't work that well the first time. And that really freed up our energy to be much more creative and much more accepting of our situation. And forgiveness made up for everything else. And the frustration went down, the anger went away. We just did so much better with one another. And again, I don't think my family story is much different than anyone else's. So how could this work in your own family or your own work situation to give up some of the expectation of perfectionism and instead to be in a more heartfelt dialogue about what everyone's needs are, and to simply know that it takes a long time to get to the point where things are working smoothly, and that's just part of the process. So my question is, how can we start using this here in our UU Fellowship of McMinnville, in our community here? You know, it's actually already happened. Yes, indeed. We are trying to reshape the Social Justice Committee. And we're also starting our pledge drive in less than 2 weeks. So with social justice, a few UUFM members recognize the impermanence. What had gone on before is not happening now, especially during the COVID epidemic. There are still tasks to be done though, so we need some improvisation of how we can meet those needs. But many people are not stepping up because they fear they don't have the amount of time that can be required. So in the planning group, an aha moment happened. Let's do less projects. Let's keep them local. Let's reevaluate along the way so that we can do them well. And let's look forward with hope that when COVID is over, how we might expand into a different picture and reality. Because we'd like to show up in larger groups. We'd like to go back to volunteering with YCAP. And our pledge drive, I'm going to say, has the same challenge. I'm going to change that to opportunity. As we begin to think about how much we can pledge here for UUFM, in our next fiscal year, we are being asked to improvise and to deal with the impermanence. We're going to improvise as a response to the impermanence. So it's a new fiscal year. It's a newer minister, although I've been here for a while now. And we are hopefully emerging from COVID. This is our time for co-creating together and demonstrating attentiveness to not only what we need as individuals, but what our fellowship here needs as a whole. A proposed budget is a spontaneous conversation about who we are and what is possible. It's an opportunity for magic and bliss if we enter it with an open heart. A budget is about our values and our commitment to uphold ourselves and others. It's an awakening of those altruistic intentions. How do we serve one another in our community? Recognize those connections as that interdependent web rises before us and between us and in us. So think large for UUFM. I'm not afraid to think big as we emerge out of the dark of COVID, and we are going to reimagine ourselves into a new world. Amen, and blessed be.